first thing I do want to do is I want to thank our sponsors for this event. Really, really amazing sponsors. We have Cooley, which is a law firm that specializes in education technology, and we have Tuck Advisors, which does mergers and acquisitions for ed tech companies. If either of those are things you are looking for, legal or M&A advice, please check them out. My name is Alex Sarlin. I am the co-founder and CEO of Edtech Insiders, and I am so excited about this event. We are getting to share from a truly, real visionary in the EdTech product market space. He has taught product market fit in EdTech multiple times to dozens, maybe hundreds of product managers around the world. And we're getting a really great taste of it today. So let me give the formal introduction of Matt Walton. Matt Walton is a product coach and advisor who works with EdTech startups and scale-ups. He also runs fellowship programs, like I just mentioned, on finding product market fit in EdTech and in building mission-led teams, very important for EdTech companies. He was one of the founding team and the chief product officer at FutureLearn, which is one of Europe's biggest EdTech platforms, partnering with hundreds of universities that grew to over 14 million learners and secured over 50 million pounds in investment. He was also recently the fractional CPO at the London Interdisciplinary School. We call that LIS. That's a startup university that organizes around problems, not subjects. Matt started his career at the BBC, where he discovered his path in product, and both of his parents are teachers, and they made sure to tell him never to go into education, which is why we see him here today, disregarding his parents. With that, let me kick it over to Matt Walton to take us away. Product market fit in EdTech.
Thanks very much, Alex. Delighted to be here. This is such an amazing community, so it's really great to kind of be amongst you all and be able to kind of, I guess, share some stuff which hopefully will be quite useful to you. So yeah, as Alex mentions, I started my career in product at the BBC, and that was really about, I guess, bringing together content people, designers, engineers, and so on to try and make new digital things, like in the early days of the BBC on the internet. And then after I left there, I freelanced for a bit and found my way into the world of FutureLearn, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And as Alex mentions, I now work with lots of EdTech startups, scale-ups, and people that are kind of maybe in established organizations trying to kind of do something new and different. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. So I thought I'd get into this by telling you a little bit more about FutureLearn, and it kind of, I guess, brings to life the topic that we're going to get into today, which is this kind of idea of the never-ending road, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the highs and lows along the journey. So for those of you who don't know what FutureLearn was, so we were born in 2013 as a kind of reaction to the MOOC movement that was kicking off in the US. So the Open University in the UK, which is actually, I think, the biggest university by student numbers in Europe, and has been around since the 1960s doing distance learning, and was set up to make learning available to many more people than had had access to it before. Basically saw what was going on over in the US with things like Coursera, where I think Alex was at, and edX, and thought this could be disruptive. And interestingly, they were set up, or sorry, their vice chancellor was someone who wasn't like kind of classic vice chancellor background. And he basically was from Microsoft, and he saw essentially the way through as to set up a startup. Now, I guess in terms of the highs, we kind of got traction very quickly with the universities. So like within the first week, we got 12 university partners signed up, and within a couple of months, we got 26 of the top 30 UK universities signed up. And fairly quickly, like learners followed. So our first courses that we kind of launched fairly quickly as well, we had to cap at 10,000 learners because there was like really massive demand for these courses. And that kind of continued to grow. So like within a year, we'd gone past the kind of 1 million learners registering on the platform. And it continued on like that for some years. Partners also then started to kind of come in from like other places, like so Australia. Fairly quickly we started to build quite a foothold in, and then we were quite pleased when we started to get our first US partners in 2016, because obviously Coursera and edX were providing some stiff local competition. And then the other interesting thing, I guess, in terms of what we started to feel in terms of a kind of like market tug, was our partners essentially came to us asking if we would run their degrees on our platform, which was something we had in the back of our minds, but this happened kind of much sooner than we'd kind of anticipated. And then I guess other kind of notable things in terms of the sort of highs, as Alex mentioned, we got a number of rounds of investment from the Open University, but then in 2018, the SEEK group invested 50 million into the platform in order to kind of scale us further. Now, in terms of lows, I think it's safe to say that we, I guess, struggled to find the right business model. So we were born with this kind of notion that MOOCs were free. We fairly quickly started to experiment with selling like certificates at the end of courses. We looked at things like introducing an upgrade model where you could essentially bundle a certificate with ongoing access and assessment and things like that. We looked at subscription offers and so on. But that was definitely, I think, something that even by the time I left, we hadn't fully cracked. We also struggled somewhat to get partners to rerun valuable courses or run courses in the right thing. So that was something that we kind of constantly sort of were wrestling with in terms of ways to do that. And in terms of the pandemic, I think, fueled by a lot more investment than we'd had, Coursera were definitely much more ready for that moment than we were. We grew massively, but with things like the Coursera for Campus products, they definitely kind of grew much more quickly than we did. And I guess the last thing to say on this is so I guess 2.5 years after I left and the kind of EdTech bubble bursting, FutureLearn did go through a kind of significant round of layoffs, and they ended up actually selling to the Global University Education Systems Group. And so they're kind of going again in terms of like finding the right kind of market fit. So I guess this kind of, I talk about this really to kind of illustrate the fact that like this is a hard thing. Like you kind of go through these kind of peaks and troughs. And it basically gave me this kind of fascination for this sort of concept of like product market fit and how does it apply in our particular unique context. How do you know if you've got it? And then what do you do to go about kind of finding it? So this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to try and save plenty of time at the end for questions. So if you have questions along the way, please pop them into the Q&A or chat, and we will kind of come to them at the end. I'm also going to be in the second half of this talking about case studies. So over the last couple of years, I've been collecting case studies from a whole range of EdTech leaders who've been there and done it in EdTech and talked to them about what was kind of successful and what were the things that they found worked. And so I've pulled out 6 insights, and I'm going to be talking about these later on. But before we get into those, I thought it was worth kind of sort of starting off by thinking about this idea of product market fit and how does it apply in the world of EdTech and learning. So going right back to the start, this idea of product market fit was first coined by this man. So this is Mark Andreessen, probably familiar to many of you. He's one of Silicon Valley's biggest investors, and he was an early internet pioneer with founding Netscape. And he basically coined this idea of product market fit in an essay called The Only Thing That Matters. Now, his contention was that as product people, we often care a lot about the product and getting that out to people like once we've built it. But actually, we needed to think much more about the market. And so he coined this idea of product market fit, which he said was being in a good market with a product that can satisfy that market. And he went on to say that in a great market, which he described as a market with lots of potential customers, the market pulls the product out of the startup. And conversely, if you're in a terrible market, you can have the best product in the world and an absolutely killer team, and it doesn't matter, you're going to fail. Now, this idea has been built on by like quite a lot of people since then. And one of the ones that I particularly like and we cover in the program that Alex mentioned is Lenny. So Lenny obviously went to his extensive black book of people that he knows to kind of come up with ways that they define product market fit. And he boiled it down to these 3 things. You've made a product that people want. You can make a profit delivering this product to people at scale. And you can find and keep people sustainably. Now, he kind of talked about it as a spectrum, as like not necessarily a binary thing that you do or don't have. So this is the kind of first, I guess, key point I want to land, that it's not a binary thing and there are these different dimensions to it. And then the second kind of key point really comes from the title of this talk. So Brian Balfour wrote an essay that he called The Never-Ending Road of Product Market Fit. And in that he said, this process never ends, primarily for one reason, which is that your market doesn't sit still, it's always moving. And as your market moves, your product needs to move with it, making product market fit a pulse that you need to constantly keep your thumb on. So two key points to keep in your head. First, product market fit, not a binary thing, like kind of lots of different dimensions to it, and you may or may not have it to greater or lesser extents on those dimensions. And the second is it's not a one-time thing. It's a thing that you're going to kind of constantly need to work on. So how do you know if you have product market fit? And this is where I'm going to start to bring in how does this apply in the unique world that we all operate in. So there's another kind of product concept, which I think is quite a helpful one to think about. And it's often referred to as the 4 product risks. Now, the first 3, I think, were devised originally by IDEO, who are known, obviously, for design thinking. So when you're creating innovative products, are they desirable, are they viable, and are they feasible? And the 4th, usable, I think, was added by Marty Kagan. And this is where this idea of product risk started to emerge. Now, what I've done is to come up with a kind of definition for how these apply in the world of EdTech. And I've framed them from the perspective of learners. Potentially, like depending on the kind of product that you're working on, you might want to think about them from the perspective of the educator. But if we look in the kind of top left-hand corner here, we've got desirable. So are you delivering an experience that learners want and need? And those are 2 different things. In the viable bucket, you can reach and retain learners sustainably and make a profit. Feasible, you can deliver the learning outcomes in a repeatable and scalable way. And then usable, learners can achieve the learning outcome in a way that is practical. Now, these obviously kind of, you can see how they relate quite a lot to the sort of concepts that Lenny was talking about. Now, why have I plotted these on a 2x2, you may be asking yourself? So I've done that because what I think is quite an interesting way of visualizing what's going on here is that the top 2 are very much about the market. So is the thing that you're creating, is it desired in some way? Are you meeting a need? And is it viable? So those are very much kind of market things. And then the bottom 2 are very much more kind of product in focus. So is it usable and is it feasible to deliver? And then the stuff that you've got on the left-hand side is typically much more kind of demand, customer, learner focused. So is it a thing that they want and is it a thing that they can use? And then the things on the right-hand side, is it viable and is it feasible? Very much around the kind of supply, business, educator side of things. So this starts to become quite a sort of interesting mental model with which to then start to test, well, which dimensions are you feeling kind of confident on? And where might you be making some risky assumptions about your product and like not finding traction? Now, at this point, it's perhaps worth reflecting on why product market fit is actually quite a hard concept when it comes to the world of education. So in the desirable bucket, like education products tend to like be a kind of marketplace of some kind. You tend to have a learner, you often have an educator, you may even have like an employer or a parent or a university or a school, and all of these different kind of actors in the system and understanding their needs and wants and how they kind of interrelate with each other makes it quite a complex thing to understand. And then there's this point that I kind of made earlier that what the learner wants and needs are often different things. And you'll find educators doing something that they think learners need, but they actually don't want it. In the kind of viable kind of bucket, learning is not a constant, like no matter like how much people like us think that maybe it should be. But generally people turn to it in moments of need or transition. And this makes things like retention quite an interesting concept to start to grapple with. There's often gatekeepers in the mix. So maybe there is like a kind of school district, or maybe there are parents, or maybe there are employers. There is somebody who may be mediating the delivery of that learning experience. And there's often some weird expectations about value. So in the MOOC world, often people kind of expected it to be kind of given away for free as some kind of social good. Certainly in the UK, degrees are kind of sort of valued based on the kind of reputation of brands rather than necessarily a huge amount to do with the actual product itself. From a feasibility point of view, like learning experience are often about human connections, and those are really hard to scale. And I think this is where like there's a lot of obviously excitement in EdTech around like the potential for generative AI. Subject matters are kind of also can be fast moving in order to keep things up to date. And in the usable kind of category, learning is hard. Like it's something that people generally have to kind of stick with or make themselves do, which means that there's going to be a lot of kind of friction to kind of get over to do that. It's also laggy, like learning takes time. So it takes time for you to be able to see what is going to be effective and what is kind of delivering the outcomes that you're after. So just to kind of go back to that kind of FutureLearn example. So in the desirable thing, as I mentioned, we kind of fast got traction with universities and learners, but actually getting people to pay for it was a challenge. So we then started to focus on a group we called the advancers, who were people that were learning for their career. And we found that they were the ones that were most likely to pay. And then it was hard to get universities to kind of maybe deliver the right kinds of courses for that group. So we started to focus on things like commissioning or finding new partners to work with that might produce the kinds of content that we knew those groups wanted. In the viable category, we had to experiment a lot with SEO, with a viral model, because paid marketing was simply too expensive when you were competing with people selling expensive things like degrees. And as I mentioned, there was this kind of constant exploration around business models. From a feasibility point of view, we found that we needed to work with like a lot of different kind of partners in order to build our catalog, because universities was kind of so volatile in kinds of the things that they may or may not do. And in order to get them to rerun it, we actually switched the model from a kind of like cohort-based model to much more of an on-demand model, which changed the paradigm in terms of how universities felt about running them. So hopefully that has kind of given you a kind of idea and a mental model to start to think about maybe what it is you're doing yourselves. So we're going to do a quick poll here. Alex has already put it up, and I think we've got a number of people who have already answered it. What I want to know is which of these quadrants is your worst quadrant? And maybe like if you're feeling willing and comfortable, maybe pop some reasons in the chat as to why that is, and maybe I'll kind of pull out a couple of people to maybe kind of talk about that. So it looks like we've got a fairly even split, which is quite interesting. Viable is out there in the lead, and I think that is probably fairly typical for what you might see.
Matt, there's a request to go back one slide so people can see the quadrants as they vote.
Yep, sorry, I'm going to actually go on one slide because I have already thought about that. I just didn't move the slide on. Thanks, Alex. So does anyone want to come off mute and maybe like kind of explain why they put what they put in the chat? And we'll do maybe a couple of those before we start part two. So is that Silky has got their hand up?
Yes. Hello. I was just typing to you, actually. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, wonderful. So we're developing a Eduverse, excuse me, my voice, based learning platform, partnership platform that also enables enables teacher training for Ed 3.0. It requires Ed 3.0, like a very different approach to teaching, which is, more based on the future of, providing resources to the students and then allowing more student-directed learning. It's very powerful when it happens. The biggest challenge is two in terms of stakeholders. So one is teachers, very afraid, it's so entrenched in their way of thinking of what teaching means, having a hard time moving away from a, knowledge transmission role to, a coach and mentor and enabler. Where then, learning can happen very rapidly in a virtual setting. And then also parents, we all know, or I shouldn't say we all know, but it's common narrative that the K-12 is kind of failing students, not preparing them for the future. I happen to believe that very much, that, yes, you need numeracy and literacy, but from there, there's major transformation required, but we can't kind of pivot from the core because parents particularly see education, particularly private education, as an insurance policy. You know, and then also, you know, universities, there's a very entrenched what is required to enter university, you know, with it, which is subject driven. So it's dealing with, like, students are great. Students are on board with a new approach, by getting teachers to change how they're doing it, changing what we're teaching, and parents kind of feeling to let go a little bit of the, you know, the insurance policy they're really buying.
And which was the one that you voted on?
That I put that under viable, like, but that's the biggest challenge. But we're, you know, we're overcoming it. Like, we have
I think it's
teacher training now, so
cool.
include.
Thanks very much. So yeah, I think that kind of is a kind of common thing, that if you're trying to do something new, then often it's about kind of educating a kind of new paradigm. So that's definitely something that we experienced in the world of MOOCs, is that you kind of almost had to teach people what the thing was. Maybe we've got time for like kind of one more kind of quick reflection, and then I'll kind of move on to the next bit. So someone else want to put their hand up? Oh, and there's 10 seconds to answer on the poll. Gabriella.
Hi, yes. Thank you. I'll chime in really quickly. I put viable, and I think it's really, I think the profitability of it, I think, you know, obviously is linked to retention, which is obviously linked to value proposition. And I think it's really, at least in our experience, it's been really hard to identify the actual value proposition, you know, that's making the retention happen without just asking them what they think the value proposition is, because there's so many elements that play into a quality experience in education online, right? There's the peer-to-peer, there's the quality of the coaches, there's the quality of the content, there's the quality of the experience. Like, there's so many elements that are hard to isolate, that I feel like that's really hard to crack.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And I think probably what you've also touched on there is like this, like, challenge, I guess, around like the retention, like in terms of like, is it a thing that people want to keep using? And I think often, like, you know, education has a sort of B2C problem, in that the acquisition costs tend to be quite high, which is why you see so many organizations pivoting to B2B.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. That's hopefully started to kind of bring to life like how this is sort of, I guess, a useful way to start to help you think about the challenges that you've got and in what quadrant you're in. Right. So let me, shall I shut this poll? Share results. Right, there we go. I'll leave Alex to sort out the poll. So the second part is where we're going to kind of explore like this idea of like how you find product market fit. So I'm going to be talking about these case studies, as I kind of mentioned earlier. Now, as I go through each of the insights and the kind of stories behind them, I want you to think about that thing that you've got in your head about your kind of key worry and challenge, and then think about how the insights that I'm going to share might help you address that challenge. So hopefully this will kind of be a kind of nice bit of active listening and might give you some kind of answer by the end of this session. So the first insight is to pay attention to trends. Now, there's lots of different kinds of trends, and so I'm going to start by like perhaps the most sexy trend of all, which is regulatory. I know you all love it. So this example is Multiverse. So they are an apprenticeship provider in the UK. I think they've recently launched in the US as well. And they were basically founded as a business around a new kind of piece of policy that happened in the UK, which was called the Apprenticeship Levy. And this basically made it mandatory for employers beyond a certain size to offer apprenticeships to their staff. And if they didn't do a certain percentage of that, then they had to essentially pay away that money in tax. And so they lost it anyway. So they built their business around this and the fact that they saw that there was this kind of growing need for tech skills and that the incumbents around apprenticeships were not actually providing those. But they continued to sort of essentially do the same trick again and again. And when I talked to Gordon McRae, who was their head of learning product, he talked about how they'd identified that there was this growing need for like data literacy. And so they found a standard in the apprenticeship frameworks for that and basically created a program out of that like by the second quarter of them running it, basically was their biggest program. So this was this kind of idea of constantly sort of finding what is those kinds of trends to then bet on. Another kind of a trend is technology. Obviously, there's lots of people that are looking at different ways to use generative AI and riding that wave. One of the people that were kind of early to the party with this was Sana Labs. So they've been going for nearly a decade, and they basically saw people like Spotify experimenting with like kind of this sort of starting to be more affordable ways of doing machine learning and recommendation models, and thought, how do we apply that to learning? And so they've been doing that ever since. And despite the fact that their product has changed quite a lot, they are still very much true to that kind of original vision. Another example of this is Kahoot. So Kahoot is the kind of popular quiz app tool that basically came about because of thinking about how this new kind of iPhone product would work in the classroom. And Jamie Brooker, the co-founder there, with his other co-founders, was asking the question, how do they take that kind of technology and use it to facilitate more human experiences? And so their goal was essentially, how do they bring the learner from like the back of the classroom to the front of the classroom for what Jamie described as like all of the right reasons? So they were very much about using that tool to make it social, but essentially probably like kind of wouldn't have been the success that it was had it not kind of bet early on this kind of new technology. Another example of this is social trends. Now, the pandemic obviously created a lot of new social trends. The Raspberry Pi Foundation used to run, in fact, probably still do, now run code clubs where they go into schools and technologists basically go and teach the kids to code. Now, obviously, schools closed in the pandemic and they were unable to do that. So Laura, their head of product, was basically tasked with how do they create a kind of online alternative to that. And so they undertook quite a lot of user research and discovered that things like Minecraft and Roblox were like really key for kids that were then trying to kind of find replacements for their, I guess, social interactions. And Laura was quite surprised at how comfortable parents were with them doing that. So she saw a real opportunity for Raspberry Pi that had kind of high brand trust to kind of like bake that into a core part of their new proposition. Another example of social trend is a story that Lucy Stonehill, the founder of Bridge U, told. So she basically had grown up going to a lot of different international schools in a number of different countries, and had seen that there was a huge demand for UK and US higher education, but there was like very little help in terms of guiding students as to kind of what they might pick. And so essentially she then created a new category and started selling to schools, like, what do you do in terms of providing a guidance product around this? You can also combine trends. So Ahmed from Trilogy talked about how Trilogy was essentially founded on the back of two trends. So one was back in 2012, about the same time that we started FutureLearn, there was this kind of rising cottage industry of boot camps. So things like General Assembly and so on. And at the same time, you were starting to see the emergence and traction of people doing university private partnerships like 2U. And so essentially, Trilogy was a way of fusing the two and creating university branded boot camps. And interestingly, like a few years later, they obviously sold quite successfully to 2U. I think it's also worth noting that trends applies to channels as well. So Maurice, who's the co-founder of Study Smarter, who do revision tools and are based in Berlin, he talked about how TikTok was a real game changer for them because they spotted very early that it was going to be like really big for Gen Z, and basically got really preferential treatment in the early days in terms of advertisers on the platform. So that's the first insight, which is about trends. The second insight is about investing in continuous discovery. Now, I think this is probably for me like the kind of the biggest to pay attention to. And our poster child for this one is going to be Springboard. So Springboard again started back in like 2013 as a kind of search engine for all of these kind of new online courses that were starting to appear. And fairly quickly, they then strang them together into what they called learning paths. And then they started to add things like mentoring around them. And then they realized that most of the people that were using their product were actually career switchers. And so they were thinking, well, what do we do for them? So in December 2016, they launched their career track product. And Parul, who is the founder there, talked about how it really changed the trajectory of their company. It improved their margins. It found them tighter product market fit. And she says it really accelerated their growth in a market which at the time wasn't very crowded. Now, they kind of kept doing it. So this chart that's on the screen at the moment shows the results of a piece of market research that they did. And they discovered that lots of their audience would be interested in a combined UI and UX course, which wouldn't have been a problem for them, except for the fact that their biggest course at that point was a UI course. And so they obviously were somewhat worried about cannibalization, but they kind of went for it anyway, and that quickly became their biggest ever course. So this idea of disrupting yourselves and not being afraid to kind of take a kind of informed risk around that was definitely a theme that came up quite a lot. So Lucy from Bridge U also kind of talked about this idea. So when Bridge U started, they started by going to schools and selling the product to schools. But during the pandemic, they realized that they had like an increasing amount of really valuable insights that universities were really kind of keen to get hold of. And so what they ended up doing is essentially selling into universities and making their schools product free. And this meant that they could essentially create even greater sort of rich insights for universities, but it also helped them with their mission, which was essentially how do they provide more and more of these kids with the right kind of guidance to get them into the right kinds of universities. Open Classrooms, another example of this. So Open Classrooms launched a long time before, I guess, any of the other MOOC platforms providing free courses. And so they experimented a lot with what were the things that they could do in order to keep a lot of that content free, but still create a viable business model. And so eventually they kind of found their way into this idea of being a freemium school by adding mentoring and qualifications and so on. And by doing ones which were recognized by the French government, they also accessed a lot of funding, which means that a lot of the courses are still free to access by the learners. Now, this process is something that Joel from Sana Labs described as exploration over exploitation. And he basically worried that it's really easy to get stuck in incrementalism. So when they first launched their product, basically his product team really just wanted to improve it. They wanted to improve the kind of sign-up flow and all of that kind of stuff. But he worried that there was a real risk in iterating something that didn't have product market fit. So his big recommendation is that when you're in those early stages, don't be afraid to kind of make really big leaps and explore rather than exploit what you already have. So that was the second insight. Third insight is get close to your users. So going back to Laura from Raspberry Pi, she had this mailing list of people that were signed up for their code clubs. And so she then started to build a community out of that and kind of go to them like with testing every week. And she like talked about how useful it was to like basically be able to kind of get a load of people on the phone as they were building their product and like literally test the stuff that they were worrying about every day. Similar sort of story in terms of Kahoot, who also spent a lot of time in the early days in classrooms. And Jamie Brooker told a really lovely story, which is brought to life by this picture, which is there was a kid at the back who loved the game so much that he was standing on his desk. And I asked his teacher, is that okay? And she said, yes, he is the most disruptive kid in his year. I've never seen him this engaged in learning. And so we asked ourselves, how do we scale this? Jono from Zen Educate, who essentially provide a marketplace for substitute teachers, talked about how they started really locally. So they started in very small regions, initially in London, and they got quite close to schools and the teaching supply in that area, and they really understood what they wanted. And then every time they kind of got the flywheel to start to spin, then they would move on to the kind of next region. And so there was this kind of sense that you kind of had to jumpstart it, but once you did, you could then kind of move to another region and broadly replicate it. Although he does also point out that it was often kind of different in different circumstances. And then the final point here is, I guess, more of a kind of B2B type approach. So Gordon McRae talked about how they weren't afraid to kind of take programs to their clients when they were still figuring out what it was. And he thinks that a lot of founders and product teams really worry that that will kind of undermine their credibility in that kind of situation. But Multiverse's experience was that actually companies loved to get involved early on and were eager to kind of be involved, and that really helped them craft products that were going to be much more kind of fitting the needs of the people they were selling to. So that was insight 3. Insight 4 is focus on your North Star. So Joel, in the case study that I did with him, started off by talking about the parable of the 3 bricklayers. And this is the potentially apocryphal story of Christopher Wren, who went to the building of St. Paul's Cathedral in London when it was being built and found 3 bricklayers, and he asked them all what they were doing. And the first bricklayer says, I am a bricklayer, I am laying bricks and I'm building a wall. The second bricklayer says, I'm a bricklayer and I am earning money to feed my family. And the third bricklayer says, I am a bricklayer and I am building a cathedral. And so Joel was basically like, how do I get all of my team to talk about the cathedral that we're building, but understanding how the bricks contribute towards that? Now, they took a very kind of vision-led approach. And he actually talked quite a lot about how he doesn't really like things like the lean startup and so on. And they take an interesting approach where they like build trailers for all of their new features and put them in front of learners before they then start to kind of build them. Now, this kind of sort of idea of like being clear about what it is that you're kind of trying to do from the start came out with Trilogy. So when they first started to try and scale, they found that they had like some difficulties doing that. And so what they then did was define the magic. And Ahmed talked about how the starting point for any conversation about metrics needs to be knowing what matters. And he reckoned that great products deliver magical experiences that transcend the normal expectations and assumptions. And the key question that you need to consider is, at your very best, what makes your product truly magical? And so basically they boiled it down to the boxes that you can see on the right-hand side here. And then they worked out what would be an interesting kind of surveying framework in order to really understand how they were like instrumenting against improving that and maintaining quality. So that's that one. This is Jeff from Babbel. So Babbel is a language learning app based in Berlin, and he kind of joined them at a point where things like Duolingo were starting to get traction, and they kind of really needed to sort of re-establish their product market fit. And so he talked about one of the big parts about that was this journey to discover a new North Star, which was total learning minutes. And he said that your North Star metric should encapsulate the reason that you're all there. If you don't have a clear reason, and you're just going to set yourself up for misunderstandings, misalignments, and internal tensions. This was an idea that was also picked up by Kirsten from Buzu, another language learning app, this one based in London and Barcelona. And she talked about North Star metrics being something that your team should be able to move, and it should have a rich impact on your roadmap and just kind of constantly give your team food for thought. So what should you be experimenting on in the sprints and what should you be iterating on? And she kind of shared this kind of chart which shows the sort of input and output metrics. So at the top is your North Star metric, which is the kind of like the big thing that you're trying to move. But the trick is really to think about what are the different factors that can do that. So what are the different sorts of behaviors you're trying to influence? And then start to brainstorm the different tactics underneath those behaviors that might enable you to kind of make an impact on that kind of North Star. So being clear about that focus and that North Star was insight 4. Insight 5 is making growth everyone's job. And so this was definitely a theme that kind of came up again and again in the case studies, which was finding ways essentially to get product and marketing to be very much aligned. And Jamie Brooker talked about like trying to make basically this idea of growth everyone's job. So they would do things like get engineers and finance people to do the kind of users and customer support. So people, the whole business would really kind of like have that kind of empathy with their kind of users and user needs. And then this idea of like what I would call product channel fit kept emerging, which is that if you kind of start to like acknowledge which of the kind of main like marketing channels is your primary channel, how do you kind of start to mold your product around that channel to kind of be more successful at how you grow? So I'm going to bring this to life again through 3 of the kind of case studies. So the first is Blinkist, who interestingly started out by thinking they might have a kind of viral growth model. Now, Blinkist is a way that you can kind of consume a book that you think you should have read in 20 minutes by listening to it. But they realized that the key with the viral model is that essentially, in order for it to work, the product has to get better the more people use it. And that wasn't really the case with Blinkist. But what they did discover is that paid social worked really well for them, because like typically if people were using Facebook on the move, they were trying to kill time. And actually maybe they might be looking for a better way of killing time, such as spending 20 minutes listening to a book that they should have read. Meanwhile, Study Smarter talked about how they wished they'd started investing in SEO earlier. So they had a revision product, and that was fitted nicely to this kind of behavior where people would search for the kinds of content that they wanted. And so Maurice there talked about the fact that the articles and the content that they created had this kind of compounding impact on growth in a way that paid marketing didn't, which is what is brought to life in the chart on the right here. And then finally is Kahoot. So Jamie from Kahoot talked a bit about this, and essentially Kahoot really have a really great viral model, because in order to run a quiz, you have to invite other people to join the quiz, and those people that you've invited can go and create their own quizzes. So you kind of get this natural viral effect. Now they sort of supercharge that by creating a really kind of interesting brand with catchy music, and Jamie talks about how they really started to see this come to life when they started to see these memes appearing. And not only did they see that on the learner side, they also saw this happen from a teacher side, and that they were sort of amazed at the kind of reaction that they were getting in the classroom, and that really like fueled their growth. So yeah, step back, think about which is the kind of key channel that you're trying to leverage and what suits your product most, and then lean into it. And how do you mold your product better to meet the needs of that channel? The final insight kind of brings all of what I've said together, which is really this idea that you need to develop a growth mindset. So Joel from Sana Labs had this kind of quote that he sort of acknowledges doesn't really make sense, which is doing something difficult is easier than doing something easy. And he reckoned that this kind of big, kind of bold mission that they had allowed them to raise funds, recruit talent. And if you had great talent, then it's much easier to do like hard things than trying to build a niche product that no one wants to dedicate their lives to. And then the final quote I'm going to kind of give to the kind of queen of disruption, Parol from Springboard. And she said that there's no point where you should ever say, okay, I'm done. It's very important to cultivate a growth mindset. And even when you're in a 9-year-old company, you need to continue to think about what's relevant for today's customers and build for that. So just to recap, the 6 themes that I mentioned were: pay attention to trends, invest in continuous discovery, get close to your users, focus on your North Star, make sure that growth is everyone's job, and develop a growth mindset. And that last one is particularly important because it's a never-ending road. Now, I set you all a challenge, which is which insight can help you most with your biggest product worry. So hopefully at the beginning you had a thing in your head. As I've been talking, you've been reflecting on that thing. And so we're starting to get some interesting results here. So getting close to your users feels like a kind of winner at the moment. Fairly even spread. And I'm very pleased to see that no one's gone for develop a growth mindset, because that really does bring the whole lot together. There we go. Right. Whilst you're filling in that poll, we'll see where the results are. I'm going to do a little brief marketing spiel, and then we're going to open to the floor for questions. So as Alex mentioned at the top, I run a program on this stuff. And because it is hard and a never-ending road, what I try and do is bring together kind of small cohorts of people that are wrestling with this challenge to kind of work through it. And my next cohort is starting on the 7th of October. There's self-paced learning material where we work through the kind of concepts, some methods that you can go to put into practice right now. And it's all brought to life through these kind of case studies that we've been working on today. Alongside this program, and it's a program that people I think really love, it's got an NPS score of 75, is a sort of companion program, which is essentially once you've kind of, I guess, found that initial traction and maybe you're starting to grow, how do you grow it in a way where you're kind of keeping that kind of mission-led approach intact. So essentially, this is a product mindset from the point of view of like how you build and grow teams. And I'm starting a cohort of that at the end of October. So again, if you're interested in that, go to the link and you can book in a kind of admission call with me. Last thing, I also said that I would share a link where you can get all of these case studies. So they're all available for free on Substack. So if you go to edtechfellowship.substack.com, you can find all of the case studies I've shared. And if you subscribe, I'm sharing new ones every week. I also talk about this stuff on LinkedIn, so feel free to go and follow me on LinkedIn as well. Right, that's it from me. I'm going to hand back over to Alex, who's going to host the Q&A.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Matt. So many insights, a lot of really interesting chat happening. I want to start with a question that came up about 10 minutes ago. I thought it was really a good one, which is when you were talking about getting close to users. Mark Simpson, Mark, if you'd like to do your question and come off camera, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I'll just start to read it. You interrupt me if you'd like. But he says, while I agree, oh, there he is. Okay, go for it.
Hey, Mark.
But my question is, how do you get the feedback and input from experts? Often when you're engaging your customers are in current thinking, and then they see how it's always been. How do you get the futurist?
I'm struggling to hear you, Alex. Do you want to read out what you had?
Yeah,
sorry.
The connection's a little tricky there, but basically, during the user section, he's saying that while getting close to users is critical, users also bring expectations about what already exists. They're not always looking for the next thing. That's sort of like the famous, faster horses. How do you leverage through partners or through users, but how do you figure out how to interpret users' requests without just, responding directly? Like, how do you get to what they're really looking for and build accordingly?
Yeah, sure. So I think the key thing is that you're not asking them what they want, because, if you do that, then they're kind of going to, give you answers about things that exist and but what you want to kind of do is get them to really tell stories about things that they need, pain points that they've existed. And so this requires kind of a bit of digging. And there's a kind of interview technique known as jobs to be done, which is really kind of helpful in this kind of context. So I think basically, essentially get them to tell you about situations that they've been in the past, or maybe that they're in now, and get them to tell you about what they did and ask them why, ask them what they did next, ask them what they might have used instead. And then that will really start to kind of uncover the need and the pain. And from that, and you might get people telling different stories and so on, but if you do that, even with 6 people that are, I guess, of a similar kind of demographic or in a similar place, you'll start to see the themes where they might say different things, but it's actually the same need or job to be done that you could then potentially go and do something about. So yeah, the key is not really do you need a faster horse, but it's recognizing that people want to get from A to B, and that horses are kind of expensive, and you have to clean them and feed them, and they're quite uncomfortable to ride on. And once you kind of start to understand those sorts of stories, and you're like, right, how do we create something which is faster, that you don't have to feed in quite the same way, although obviously put petrol in it, but you get my point.
Yep. And I would just add one thought to that, which is one of the things that makes EdTech so complicated in terms of what Matt was showing earlier, is that for many people, learning is a means to an end. They're not there to learn. They're there to get a degree or get a job. They're there to connect with people. They're there to move to the next phase of their career. They have a sort of secondary goal. So sometimes the learning, or pass a test, whatever it is, sometimes the learning sort of folds under that. So when users are asking for particular things, you might want to double down and say, well, what's your real goal? Why are you here? You're probably not here just to, memorize new facts or watch lectures. You're here for something deeper. And why does that thing help you? And that can, I think, sometimes encourage that kind of better user research. There's a question that I'm sort of going to suss out a question. People, please do keep asking. But there was one about EdTech sales cycles being very slow. And because they're so slow, especially in K-12, how do you get to the right part of a trend when the buyers are, ready? It's like, how do you get early adopters and then later get people to buy in? How do you sort of find the kind of trend that will span the whole sales cycle?
Yeah, this is really tricky, and a really kind of common theme, as you say, in EdTech. So I guess there's a couple of things that I often see as kind of common approaches to this. So one is to start in the consumer space. So if you think about, I guess, something like Coursera, for example, like they started to get traction in the consumer space. And then it was only when they started to build that kind of credibility and so on that they then were able to go and sell into a kind of B2B type scenario. And you'll see like loads of companies go on similar journeys, like, Reforge started out in the kind of consumer space. They found people who wanted to do their courses, went to go and expense them, and then this started to like build the traction with employers, and then they now have developed a kind of Teams version. So I think that's kind of one version of it. And I guess like probably it's a similar variant of the same thing, but it's this kind of like, can you get like teachers or people using it in schools? Like, and this is essentially what Kahoot did, I think, which is like basically get people using it and advocating for it. Like that then allows you to then like basically then start to then go and sell to the kind of decision makers. And very much also, I guess, kind of a similar approach that we really did in terms of selling FutureLearn into universities. We found like, I guess, sort of passionate change makers often in the educational side of the business that then came and used us as a platform. And then as we kind of grew, then we would like kind of end up having to go through the hoops with IT departments and those kind of things. But I think it's like you have to kind of find the people with the end needs, which then means you're crafting a product that is going to be valuable for them, and then demonstrate that to, I guess, the people that then might pay for it. Now, you may not end up making as much money to start with, because the problem that you often have in the consumer side is that you, particularly where it's a sort of one-off experience, or it potentially is something where people are wanting it at a moment in time, you're going to need to keep finding those customers, and that's probably going to be expensive in terms of acquisition, which is, I think, why you see so many EdTech products go on the journey of like starting with consumers and then ending up with B2B, which is a more repeatable revenue, because you might be basing it on thousands of learners rather than individuals.
Yeah, or fighting to get into schools, so you get these long-term contracts, but it's bigger contracts. We have a question from Anjali. Anjali, do you want to go off camera and ask it, or would you like me to ask it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So I'm curious to hear your perspectives on how larger market dynamics in the US, specifically like state K-12 curriculum adoption cycles, play into product market fit for EdTech.
Oh, there's a big question. So I guess it's about, again, it comes back to kind of understanding the needs of like what people want, and I guess what they're grappling with. So I guess a recent case study that I've published is, so in the UK, we have a thing called the Oak National Academy, which essentially has digitized the whole national curriculum in the UK, which is your equivalent of K-12. And they were actually born in the pandemic because like suddenly like all of the schools closed, and it was like, how do we like provide an alternative? But what they've done is they've now found a kind of, I guess, interesting model where they've digitized all of that content, and now they're experimenting with things like AI tutors and things on top of that. So they're like helping teachers plan lessons and tackle those kind of challenges, but using that kind of corpus of materials and stuff that they've built upon. So I guess they're kind of like identifying the kind of core needs of teachers, but then like knowing what are the constraints that they're kind of working with and kind of turning that into an asset. So yeah, I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but like, I guess it's an example of like, yeah, where you're working around some of those constraints. Feel free to like build on your question if you need to.
There was a theme in the chat as well about Eric Tao mentioned how they were doing a 3D sort of a 3D multiverse, world type of product, which can be a very cutting edge tech product. They changed their positioning. Oh, there you go. Eric, please.
Yeah, this is all very recent, actually. So We've had a product in market since January, and we've been, we were at one point marketing it as, oh, we're a trend. But then we started to get traction when we started changing our positioning more to student-centered learning, project-based learning, a way to provide alternative assessment. So really speaking the language of the buyer, I think, is what we started doing. Now we're starting to get a lot of interest from administrators, not necessarily the teachers. So that's just what's happening very recently with us.
I mean, I think this is an example of I think there's kind of two kinds of products in terms of positioning, and you can either basically normalize the weird or weird the normal. So maybe there's a thing that has been there for years. So I guess in the apprenticeship field, what Multiverse did is they made it kind of cool, new and different. It was kind of tech skills and it's going to be delivered in a different way and so on. But it was essentially a thing that already existed and people understood, and they kind of made it sexy and cool. So that's one kind of product. And then the other category is essentially there's something weird and different, and that's really about how do you make it seem normal and safe. So for example, when Airbnb started, it was like going to sleep on someone's floor that you don't know, that's kind of weird and scary. So they kind of lent into this sort of what has become their belonging brand and made it feel normal and weird and safe, and added features like verification and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think your example there is an example of that, which is, and with MOOCs, so we'd never called what we did at FutureLearn massive open online courses, because we were this is some weird acronym that people don't understand. Educators were all over it. So when we talked to universities, we definitely talked about MOOCs. But when we talked to learners, we were these are short courses you do online. Because that's what real human beings understood.
Yeah, exactly. It was actually a conversation I had with the founder of Flocabulary that kind of switched our positioning, because he had the same problem, back in the day, is how do we convince teachers in schools that rap videos are the way to, to teach. So, that was sort of a pivotal moment for us.
Yeah. And I would just add a quick thought to that, which is that one of the things that's so complicated about EdTech is you have multiple stakeholders you're trying to convince. And I think some people do things for the learners, hey, wouldn't rap be great for students? Wouldn't 3D worlds be great? And you should tell the students that, but for the buyers, for the districts, sometimes you have to wrap it in, like you said, the language that they care about. They have a district-wide initiative to improve their project-based learning or their expeditionary learning, and you say, oh, great, that's what this is now. You sort of find the connections to what people are looking for. I can't tell you how many people I've consulted with who are this is the coolest product, and they're thinking about the end user, the student. But you're that's not the person who's going to sign the check. What are you telling them? We have one more question from Ruka. I know we're coming on time now. Ruka, do you want to ask your question? I think it'll be the last one.
Yeah, sure. So I'm still pretty early stage right now. I'm building out a wireframe to get in front of administrators to test out our product. We're actually more specifically focused on teacher development programs. So just using AI to kind of build that out. We want to initiate pilots to have teachers and administrators use the product. I have heard that pilots should be paid because if you offer a free pilot, then you may do all this work and then they don't purchase it. But it's a great way to see if people are willing to buy your product, which might indicate product market fit in a paid pilot. I've also heard that schools might not be willing to pay money for it because of their budget. So I'm just curious as to how you approach that when you're trying to use it as an opportunity to test your market.
I mean, I guess it sort of depends on the context and maybe what are the riskiest assumptions that you're trying to test. So maybe if one of the things that you're do schools have a budget to pay for this? Then actually asking them to pay for it is actually a kind of a useful thing to do. There's also if you're wanting to sell to those people again, there's a kind of expectation that you're setting. So even if maybe you want to kind of get them on board for an early product, then maybe set a price point, but we're going to discount this because it's a kind of pilot or something like that. So you kind of anchor the sort of value in the minds, but then maybe you get in there with a discount. So I think it sort of really depends on what you're trying to find out. If what you're trying to find out is like, I want to run this like learning experience with some actual teachers and I need to find that out first, because that's your risky assumption, then maybe you discount it in order to like get there and like be able to test that quickly. But if like actually when you do, what you want to do is like, are they going to pay for it, or do I need to go and get someone else to pay for it? Then maybe you want to ask them to pay for it.
Perfect. Thank you.
It's a great question, and it's something a lot of people wrestle with in the space. So I'm glad you're thinking about it. We are at time, but I want to thank Matt Walton. Matt, this has been fascinating, and you know, for everybody here, we will be sending out the recording of the session in a follow-up email. You should also, Matt, if you want to flip back to your fellowship slide for a moment, I highly recommend looking into the next cohort of Matt's Finding Product Market Fit in EdTech fellowship. It's much more in depth. Obviously, lots of great stuff here, but there's much more in depth. You can actually have these deep conversations that everybody is having, you know, over time, and actually connect with other product people and really, really make sense of it. This is a hard world to be in. I also want to recommend to everybody, you know, subscribe if you haven't to the EdTech Insiders newsletter and podcast. We also have a paid subscription tier at this point, which gives you access to a WhatsApp community. It has incredible people in it, as well as early access to events and other things. Thanks so much for being here. You know, it's the community that makes this such an amazing place to be in. And you can share actually, Matt, I'll ask you, but question, can we share the recording to people who are not here?
Yeah, do it.
Yep, absolutely.
Spread the joy.
Spread the joy. That's a little taste of all of this product market fit thinking. Everybody, good luck getting close to your users and working on your viability, among other things. And we will see you next time yeah.
And
Matt,
remember,
do you want to have the last word? Yeah.
I was going to say, remember, it's a never-ending road. Like, keep iterating.
Keep iterating. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for your time.